The wind raced through the sleepy village of Elderbrook, tossing the leaves like confetti across cobbled streets and over rooftops that wore moss like green velvet hats. Rain had fallen all morning, and now everything sparkled: stone steps, dripping branches, and the tiny window panes of Maplewood Antiques, a little shop that smelled of cinnamon, secrets, and stories long tucked away. Inside, the shelves whispered with treasures, clocks that no longer ticked, dolls with paint-chipped cheeks, and spoons that once stirred royal puddings. But at the very back of the shop, behind a curtain of beaded glass and shadows, there sat a teacup. Pale as moonlight and rimmed with faded gold, the teacup rested in a velvet-lined box, all by itself, away from the chatter of the other antiques. No one had noticed it for a long, long time. But today, something stirred. A tremble passed through the teacup's handle, ever so gently, like a sigh waking from sleep. A droplet of leftover rainwater, blown in from the open window, landed with a soft pat against its porcelain surface. And then, just for a moment, the teacup glowed. It was not bright. Not enough for the busy shopkeeper to notice as he sorted old postcards by the till, but it was enough to rouse something deep within the teacup, a flicker. A flickering memory of another place, another time, when laughter rang like bells and small fingers wrapped around its base with the gentlest care. Somewhere in the swirl of old air and forgotten echoes, the teacup remembered a name. And then it remembered why it could never forget. Long ago, before it was tucked away behind the beaded curtain, the teacup had lived in a sunlit cottage at the edge of a silver fern forest. Back then, it sat proudly on a wooden shelf painted sky blue, part of a cheerful tea set used only on very special days. The teacup had belonged to a little girl named Lila, whose laugh bubbled like spring water and whose eyes held the quiet wonder of someone who spoke to clouds and believed they listened. Lila's hands were always gentle. When she poured pretend tea for her stuffed rabbit or lined up imaginary guests at the table, the teacup never feared slipping or cracking. It felt safe, loved, and full of purpose. Even when Lila grew sad, as children sometimes do, she would hold the teacup close, whispering her worries into its round, hollow heart. The teacup listened. It always listened. But time, as it does, moved like a stream over stones. One winter, Lila had to go away. Her parents packed suitcases. The curtains were tied in knots, and the laughter in the cottage grew quiet. The teacup had waited, patient and still, for days that stretched into weeks. Then, a man came, a stranger with dusty boots, who packed up what was left, including the blue shelf, the pretend table, and the forgotten tea set. That was the last the teacup saw of the cottage, and the last time it felt warm sunlight on its rim. Now, in Maplewood Antiques, the memories returned in small waves, stirred by the raindrop and the scent of lavender soap on the hands of a young girl entering the shop. Her name was Elsie, and she had come in not for toys or trinkets, but to escape the rain. Her red boots left wet marks on the wooden floor, and her coat clung to her like a soggy blanket. Her grandmother followed behind, warm and humming, looking for old buttons and sewing tins. While her grandmother wandered, Elsie explored. She touched a birdcage with no door, peeked inside an old chest that smelled of peppermint, and tapped her knuckles against a violin case that hummed quietly in reply. But then, as if guided by a thread she couldn't see, Elsie moved past the tall clock and behind the velvet curtain. And there, her eyes found the teacup. It sat so still, so perfectly quiet, that for a moment she thought it might be just a shadow. But the moment she reached out her hand without touching it, the teacup pulsed. A soft warmth bloomed in its center, a shimmer too faint to call light, but strong enough to make her pause. Something about it felt familiar. Elsie leaned closer, nose nearly touching the edge of the glass box. Inside, the teacup remembered her. Not Elsie exactly, but the feeling of small fingers and bright eyes. It remembered kindness. It remembered hope. The teacup did something it hadn't done in years. It tried. It gathered all its memories, all its quiet magic, and it whispered. Not in words, but in a feeling that brushed against Elsie's heart like a forgotten lullaby. Elsie blinked. Her throat felt tight, like she'd heard a voice calling from far away. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt the need to hold the teacup. Not to own it or play with it, but just to hold it. When her grandmother called from the front, Elsie stepped back, heart fluttering. She hadn't touched the glass. She hadn't spoken a word, but something inside her had changed. The next day, Elsie returned. The shopkeeper smiled, surprised to see the same little girl 2 days in a row. This time, she brought a tissue-wrapped cookie and a small flower from her garden. She placed them beside the glass case without a word and sat quietly, just watching the teacup. Each day after that, she returned. Rain or shine. Sometimes she brought music, a tiny wind-up ballerina that danced on a wooden box. Sometimes she brought stories, softly told, while her grandmother browsed the shelves. And once, she brought an old scarf her mother no longer wore and draped it gently over the back of the display, like a shawl for the teacup's lonely shelf. And day by day, the teacup remembered more. It remembered Lila's giggle when the tea party spilled and her stuffed rabbit got wet. It remembered the scent of strawberry jam and buttered toast during morning sunlight. It remembered a lullaby sung in a crooked voice, a voice it now realized sounded a little like Elsie's. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with honey and tangerine, Elsie reached out again, fingers hovering over the glass box. The shopkeeper, noticing her, walked over. He had never really paid much mind to the old teacup. It was just another forgotten piece in a sea of forgotten things. But now, seeing the way Elsie looked at it, as if it were a dear friend, he took a breath. He opened the case. Very carefully, he lifted the teacup and placed it into Elsie's hands. The moment her fingers touched the porcelain, something stirred. Not loud, not bright, but deep. A swirl of golden dust lifted into the air, curling like smoke from a chimney. Elsie gasped but did not drop it. Her hands remained steady. The warmth from the teacup spread through her arms up to her chest and settled near her heart. She did not understand what had happened, but she knew this teacup was not just old. It was not just pretty. It was waiting. It had been waiting all this time. Later that evening, as the shop closed and the shadows deepened across the floorboards, the shopkeeper found something odd. Where the teacup had once sat, a faint circle of light shimmered on the velvet. It faded slowly, leaving behind only a tiny crack in the glass case that had not been there before. And in the back of the shop, behind boxes and dust, an old music box clicked to life on its own. A soft tune spilled into the air, a lullaby no one remembered teaching it. The teacup, now nestled safely in Elsie's hands, had remembered its story. But the story was not over yet. Because as Elsie carried it home in a carefully wrapped bundle, something else began to awaken. Far beyond Elderbrook, in a place where memories curled into clouds and time folded like pages in a book, a name stirred in the wind. Lila? Elsie walked home with the teacup held close to her chest, wrapped in the soft scarf she had once left draped over the display. The sky had turned dusky violet, and the wind whispered through the hedges as if passing along a secret too old to be spoken aloud. Each step she took felt strangely important, as if she was not just walking home, but carrying something back to where it belonged. That night, in her small upstairs bedroom where the ceiling sloped like a tent, Elsie placed the teacup on her windowsill. Moonlight kissed its rim, and the warmth from earlier remained, steady and comforting. She couldn't sleep. There was something inside her like a question that wanted to become a dream. She curled beneath her blanket, eyes fixed on the teacup, until her thoughts drifted into sleep. And that was when the dream began. Or was it a dream at all? The room shimmered. Her furniture melted into fog, and her blanket slipped away like a puddle of light. She stood, barefoot, in a wide field lit by stars. The grass glowed blue. Trees circled her in the distance, leaves sparkling like silver coins. In the center of the field sat a long wooden table, old and splintered, covered in lace and empty teacups. One teacup in the middle glowed softly, hers. A figure appeared tall, gentle, with eyes like softened amber. It wasn't a person in the way Elsie understood people. It looked like a memory wearing a face. The figure stood beside the table and raised its hand. The teacups began to fill, not with tea, but with little bursts of light, tiny glimmers that floated upward like fireflies. The figure pointed to Elsie's teacup, then to the stars above. A wind rose, full of whispers, and Elsie heard it. It wasn't a voice, but it said her name. She turned and saw another figure across the field, walking toward her slowly, cautiously. It was a girl slightly older than Elsie, with wild brown hair and a dress the color of frost-bitten petals. She looked familiar in the way dreams sometimes do, where nothing makes sense but everything feels true. The girl stopped just a few feet away. She carried a stuffed rabbit, worn and well-loved, its ear stitched with mismatched thread. The wind dropped. The world held its breath. Elsie looked down at the glowing teacup in her hand. Lila? The name echoed through the dream, soft but certain. This was Lila. And in that moment, the teacup remembered everything. It remembered how Lila had whispered wishes into its hollow curve, how she had cried into it the night before her family left the cottage forever. It remembered how she had promised never to forget, and how the teacup had tried, with all its little heart, to keep that promise. It had waited, in silence and dust, holding Lila's memories like precious stones, afraid they might slip away if it let go. But now, something had changed. Now, it had found someone new, someone who listened, who cared, who felt the same kind of sadness and wonder and hope that Lila once carried, someone who could help it remember without being afraid. Elsie reached out, holding the teacup toward Lila. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Then crack! A sharp sound rang through the field. The ground shivered beneath them. The trees bent low, their silver leaves rustling like warning bells. Darkness surged from the edges of the dream, a curling mist of forgotten things. Memories too long buried, twisting and clawing to break free. The field dimmed. The table shook. One by one, the other teacups shattered, their lights snuffed out. The teacup in Elsie's hands flared bright, resisting. Lila stepped back, eyes wide with fear. The whispering wind turned sharp, like broken glass. The darkness wanted the memory. It wanted the sorrow. It wanted to take everything the teacup had kept safe and pull it into the void where nothing could be remembered, nothing could be cherished. Elsie gripped the teacup tighter. She didn't know what to do. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She felt so small, so helpless. But then, she remembered. She remembered how she had found the teacup behind the curtain. How it had shimmered. How it had listened. She remembered the afternoon spent sitting beside it, talking to it, believing it mattered. Because it did matter. Not just for what it had been, but for what it could become. Elsie closed her eyes. She thought of Lila's laughter, of rainy days with red boots, of warm cookies and music boxes, and stories told in hushes and giggles. She thought of the scarf she had shared, the lullabies her grandmother hummed, the feeling of being safe, even when everything else felt uncertain. She poured those memories into the teacup, one by one, like filling it with light. The teacup began to glow again, stronger than before. The gold on its rim brightened, the crack in its handle sealed. A warm breeze pushed back the mist. The shadows hissed and recoiled. Lila gasped. Her stuffed rabbit wriggled in her arms, then smiled. The stitched ear straightened. The sadness in her eyes faded like clouds parting after a storm. The dream field began to glow with a golden hue, soft and healing. One by one, the shattered teacups on the table reformed. Each held a flickering light, a memory returned. Lila stepped forward. She reached for the teacup, now shining with a steady, comforting glow. But this time, she did not take it. She placed her hand over Elsie's and gently closed her fingers around the teacup. Then she smiled a small, grateful smile and stepped back. The wind turned warm. The trees rose tall again. The silver leaves glimmered with laughter. The field faded into light, and Elsie woke. She sat up in bed, blinking in the early morning sun. Birds chirped outside. Her window was open. And the teacup sat on the windowsill, warm and whole, no longer glowing but filled with something she could still feel. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers tingled faintly, as if touched by stars. In the air, the faintest whisper echoed, "Thank you." The dream had been real. Not in the way clocks are real, or school books are true, but in the way feelings are real. In the way stories live inside us, even when the world forgets. Elsie knew now. The teacup could remember. But more importantly, it could help others remember too. And she was no longer just a visitor to a dusty shop or a rainy day explorer. She was now the keeper of something magical, something that had waited a long time to be held again. From that morning on, something quietly shifted in Elsie's world. It wasn't loud or flashy, like a trumpet or a parade. It was soft and steady, like how the light in a room changes when someone opens a curtain just a little wider. The teacup sat on her shelf now, nestled in a folded square of her favorite scarf, always warm to the touch, as if it held a candle inside. Each day, Elsie found herself drawn to it. Not because it was magical, though she knew it was, but because it felt like home, like listening to a story she already loved. Even if she didn't know all the words yet, she began to write down things she remembered: the smell of her grandfather's coat, the sound of rain tapping on her classroom window, the day her kitten had gotten stuck in a tree and meowed like a tiny opera singer until the neighbor helped. She folded these stories into paper boats and placed them near the teacup. Sometimes, when she did, the teacup would hum so faintly that only Elsie could hear it. And once, just once, a flower bloomed beside it overnight, growing from nothing but the folded scarf and the hush of dreams. Elsie didn't tell anyone, not even her grandmother, who still visited Maplewood Antiques for buttons and tins. The magic wasn't meant for telling. It was meant for keeping like a secret between hearts. But wordless things have their own way of growing. One afternoon, a new girl named Clara joined Elsie's class. She had just moved to the village, and though she smiled, her eyes carried a heavy quiet. At recess, Clara sat alone, tracing invisible shapes into the dirt. Most of the other children didn't notice. Elsie did. That evening, at home, she took the teacup in her hands and held it close. The warmth inside it flickered gently, like a question waiting to be asked. Elsie whispered a single word: help. The next day, she brought the teacup to school, hidden safely in a padded pouch. During free reading time, when the classroom felt peaceful and the teacher read poems in a gentle voice, Elsie slipped the teacup out and placed it on Clara's desk. She said nothing, just pushed the pouch toward her, smiled, and went back to her book. Clara stared at it, puzzled, but her fingers touched the porcelain without fear. She held it for a long moment, her eyes growing distant like she was hearing something old and soft and beautiful inside it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. That afternoon, for the first time, she sat beside Elsie at lunch. And by the end of the week, they were laughing together in the library, arms filled with picture books and dreams. The teacup had remembered something Clara needed to feel, and in doing so, it had passed a bit of its story into her, too. From then on, Elsie knew what the teacup truly was. Not just a thing that remembered, but a bridge. A bridge between hearts, between what was and what could still be. So she shared it gently, carefully, only when needed, with a neighbor who missed someone far away, with a teacher who had lost her cat and quietly cried in the supply closet, with a boy who had to move and leave behind his treehouse and his friends. Each time, the teacup glowed just a little. Just enough, and with every new hand it touched, the warmth inside it grew. But the teacup never forgot Lila. Elsie often dreamed of her running through fields of windflowers, dancing in the soft rain. Lila never spoke, but she always smiled. Sometimes, she would sit beside Elsie and hold the teacup between them, their fingers overlapping, their hearts quietly knowing one another. One winter, as snow-dusted elderbrook and chimney smoke curled into the sky like wool, Elsie returned to Maplewood Antiques with the teacup wrapped in its scarf. The shop was quiet, lit by golden lamps and the tick-tock of old clocks. The shopkeeper, now older and slower, watched her walk in with kind eyes. He said nothing, just nodded and led her to the back behind the curtain of beads, where dust danced like tiny spirits in the light. Elsie placed the teacup on its old shelf. For a long moment, she stood there, her hand resting lightly on the rim. She didn't want to say goodbye. But she wasn't. Not really. Because she understood now, some stories aren't meant to be held forever. They're meant to be passed on. She looked at the shopkeeper. He smiled and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. They left it there, behind the glass once more. But this time, it wasn't alone. It sat surrounded by paper boats, ribbon-tied memories, a flower in a tiny vase, and a new tag that read, simply, "This teacup remembers. Hold it kindly." And so it waited again. Not in sadness, not in silence, but in hope. For the next pair of hands, the next warm laugh, the next soft voice that might lift it once more and whisper something worth remembering. Because some treasures do not glitter. Some treasures glow from within, lit by every heart they've ever held. And in a tiny village named Elderbrook, nestled in a shop that smelled of cinnamon, secrets, and stories, a teacup remembered forever.